Okay, let's test. Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. So, Adria, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, and I'll try to face everybody. And right. Is there anything wrong with those seats? So as Andrea mentioned, my talk today will be about learning about markets and supply chains by playing games. Before I go into the depth of my talk, I want to say a few words about the area that I'm particularly excited about, the area of my research, I-form, that Andrea mentioned. And I'll start that description with a well-known parable. You probably heard about it, right? 6 blind men encounter an elephant for the first time in their lives. And they're trying to figure out what this is. They touch the elephant in different places, and whoever touches the side of the elephant says, well, it's a wall. Whoever touches the tusk says, oh, it's like a spear. Whoever touches the tail, oh, it's like a rope. Ears, it's like a fan. So the moral of the story is, depending where you touch the elephant, it looks and feels very different. It's the same way in academic disciplines. So this slide is going to oversimplify the perspective of finance people on the firm. Then I'm going to do the same justice to the operations people, so don't worry. I won't offend only the finance people. I'll offend everybody. So this is typical perspective that we as finance people take on the firm. We view the firm as a collection of assets. There's, of course, management, labor. It's important to understand their relationship. What we focus on are the claims on those assets. Who holds them? Private, public? What do those people want who hold them? What kind of claims are those? How are they structured? Where are they traded? What is the right price for them? That's the focus, kind of this dimension of the problem that we're focusing on if we are wearing a finance hat. If you're wearing an operations hat, your perspective on the firm is different. You also understand that the firm is a collection of assets, but you try to drive to the questions, how do I make decisions that would maximize the value of those assets? And by maximizing the value of the assets, I mean maximize the profit that this firm generates. I really don't care where the profit goes afterwards as an operations person. I don't know about investors. I don't care about investors. What I care about is, how do I decide on capacity? How do I decide on pricing? How do I decide on logistics? How do I decide on quality, product variety? I also need to work with other firms. I cannot exist as a standalone firm. And I have relationship with my suppliers. I have relationships with my customers. And I need to manage those relationships as well. That becomes a very important part of my decision space as an operations person. And of course, the reality is, here's the elephant, right? It's neither the vertical dimension alone, neither the horizontal dimension alone. It's everything together. You have to understand who cares, why do they care, who are those investors are, how do different structure of the securities claims to the assets change the incentives, change the different perspectives. And also, you need to understand the decisions and relationships and everything else that comes with operations if you want to do a better job. This is the inspiration for this field of I-form, interface of finance, operations, and risk management. I take particular pride from the fact that the letter I is a small one in that abbreviation. We came up with it in 2008, just as the iPhone came out. Seemed like a great idea at the time for marketing this. It's based on these 3 disciplines: finance, operations, risk management. Kind of more generally, it rests on the foundations of various tools from mathematics, economics, econometrics, analytics, data science. These are the things that are building the foundations. Let me advertise a little bit. If you want to learn more about this field, we recently published a 2-volume set with Springer on the innovative technologies at the interface of operations and finance. In this book, we have a chapter which is tutorial on operations and finance. And this tutorial intended to provide the easy on-ramp for anybody who is interested in the interface research. What are the 7 most important things you need to know about operations? What are the 7 most important things you need to know about finance in order to combine the two together? How to publish in this field? Where the resources are. A more extended version of the same discussion is in the Foundation and Trends article that John Burge and I also wrote. That one, several hundred pages. It's a bit more comprehensive. But I would like to advertise that if you get a spark of interest in this. There are other interesting articles in the 2-volume set by Springer. The part I didn't mention is innovative technology. So people wrote articles about robots, about cryptocurrencies, about AI, about analytics, and how it all ties together with operations and finance. So enough of the self-promotion. Let's talk about markets and supply chain, right? So I talk about learning about markets and supply chains by playing games. So I'll start by talking about markets and supply chains in general. At this conference, I wouldn't dare tell you about the markets, but I'll take a chance to tell you something about supply chains. So here is a very simplified representation of PPE, personal protective equipment supply chain. I'm teaching in the US, so when I'm presenting this slide to my students, I talk about customers being in the United States. So I'll take the same perspective here as well. So you have customers on the right. When we talk about supply chains, there are actually different types of customers. There are retail customers and there's commercial customers, so hospitals versus individuals. They're buying stuff from retailers. Retailers get their things from distributors. Distributors like McKesson. Distributors buy from manufacturers. Manufacturers get their components from suppliers, contractors. One observation to make about this supply chain, it's very global. The customers are located in the US, while the contractors, the suppliers, are all over the world. For some products, I think like for masks, for example, 70% are in China. So it's a really, really long, complicated supply chain. Typically when we casually mention supply chains, whether in business press or in economics papers, we focus on a particular aspect of supply chain. Transportation, logistics, with focus on shipping companies, with focus on trucking companies, railroads, and this is what we call supply chain. This is a very narrow perspective on what supply chain actually is. These are, of course, important contributors to the supply chain. They make the physical movements of goods possible, but what is equally important, even more important, are the companies that produce goods and services before they can be moved around in the world. More importantly, in addition to the physical flow of goods, we need to focus on the informational flows that come with the physical flows. You need to know what the demand is, what the forecasts of the demands are. This is the information that's typically flowing from customer side, upstream the supply chain. You need to know the supply conditions. You need to know where the assets inventory is, at which stage of the process, when it's going to arrive, how the capacities are looking, How close are you to exhaust them? This is the information that typically flows in another direction. And lots of companies involved in managing the informational flows. Just to mention a few there on the slide. These are the big names, but there are many, many companies that focus on how information flows in supply chains. The whole movement, if you've heard about creating digital twins, this is part of this informational infrastructure on top of the supply chains. On top of the informational flows and physical flows, you have the third kind of flow, that's the financial flow. None of the transactions will happen without the proper compensation. You need to be able to process the payments, make them at the right time. You need to insure the goods. So you need companies like American Express, Bank of America, you need insurance companies. You also need markets, commodity markets, to buy some of the raw materials and sell some of the raw materials as well. So that's all part of the financial infrastructure. So supply chains are those three types of flows, physical, informational, financial, that enable the creation of goods and services and delivery of those goods and services to the finite ultimate customers. They are very complex, even for PPEs, right? Personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, gowns. They are spanning the world. When you drink a cup of coffee in the morning, that cup of coffee probably traveled around the world at least once before it made it into your cup. And I'm not even looking at milk. I'm not even looking at the paper that goes into the paper cup. Very complex systems. They're subject to all kinds of randomness. For example, when the pandemic started, we had two types of shocks simultaneously. We had the demand shock on the customer side. Everybody needed a mask. Everybody needed gloves, gowns. There were shortages. And at the same time, the suppliers in China were going into lockdown. Production was stopping. And you have this double crunch, plus all kinds of twists in the supply chain because they normally demand primarily from the commercial customers, from the hospitals, from the doctors. Normally, we don't buy masks as retail customers. Suddenly, all of the individuals are trying to buy masks. And so the demand spiked on the retail side, and the commercial side of the supply chains is not designed to satisfy that demand. So you have this very weird situation that products might be there, but they're not available to customers. Governments play a very important role in supply chains, just in regulating how the trade happens, collecting the dues that the governments collect. In the United States, government run a national strategic supply of PPEs. So they run inventory on behalf of the federal government, and they decide when, how to release that inventory into the market. Very complex system. So let's stay on the topic of supply chains for one more slide. Let's do the comparison. So what's the big deal about supply chains and how are they different from markets? So you guys all know about markets. So I'll use that as a base case and compare supply chains against it. What are the critical differences? Well, one critical difference is that supply chains typically carry fairly customized products. Not always, right? So commodities flow through supply chains as well, but customized products is the dominant framework to have in mind. Because of the customized products, you need to rely on long-term contracts and long-term relationships with your suppliers, with your customers. This is as opposed to preference to spot transactions that we typically think about as being markets. This long-term relationship also requires you to have significant trust in your counterparty. So you're the one who carries the counterparty risk. There's no exchange operator that manages this for you, at least minimizes it. Supply chains have relatively few number of participants, at least in the B2B setting. if you exclude the final customers that are numerous, naturally. There's very low transparency. Companies constantly struggle with the same problem. They have no idea what's going on in their supply chains. If you figure out for the companies how to create transparency in their supply chains, they'll make you very, very rich. Well, at least they'll get very, very rich. And the last point, and that's really going to be shocking if you have the economic background, in the supply chains, it never is the case that supply meets demand. There's always a shortage of the product at any given moment of time, or there's inventory sitting around. It's never the perfect match. There's no price mechanism, typically, that works fast enough to create the supply-demand match, right? Compare that with how markets wonderfully work to create the balance. And these are the challenges that supply chain managers are facing every day. These are the main ones, main differences. Now, despite the differences between the markets and supply chains, it is very, very useful to have the knowledge of both. Let me give you a few examples, if you're not convinced in that statement. So, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples where knowing supply chains will make you better at managing commodity markets. It's kind of obvious, especially the first statement I'm going to make, right? We know the price of a commodity. Well, let's look at the demand and supply shocks, figure out, right? Somehow they connect together to give us the price. We can be more precise and think about what is the supply. So supply is also a function of how much inventory is there to release into the market. Supply is a function of how much capacity the producers have, right? Supply is what is the flexibility that they have to release that into the market. These concepts, demand, supply, inventory, capacity, flexibility, this is the language that operations people use all the time. So for us, it's very natural. Understanding how this works is fantastic. So here's a great graph that I found thinking about this talk from a recent presentation at the US Energy Information Administration. It shows you the incredibly high correlation between the inventory and the future relative to the current spot prices, current prices. Right? Incredible correlation. So if you understand inventory, you know something about the prices. Let me give you another example, kind of along the same lines. In 2018, there was a fantastic opportunity in Permian Basin that was jeopardized by the bottlenecks in the production. And there were two kinds of bottlenecks. And you might have first-hand experience with this, now that I think about this. There was a bottleneck in production because of the shortage of workers, and there was a bottleneck of a different kind. You know, yeah, you can extract the oil from the ground, but you need to deliver it to the terminals. And there was shortage of the pipeline capacity. Right? This is where the supply chain thinking comes in handy. So you start thinking, okay, what do I do? Let's start with shortage of workers. Well, bring more workers in. Operations teaches me that if you relieve one bottleneck in your supply chain and your process, it just shifts the bottleneck somewhere else. And that's exactly what happens. Have them, right? So first of all, the salaries went up. And second of all, you still don't have enough drivers. Why? Because there's a finite capacity at which you can produce drivers. There's a capacity of the driving schools, how many drivers they can graduate within a given moment of time. And that drives your ability to use trucks. And understanding how, so this is a supply chain. I draw the supply chain for workers, supply chain for transportation. Understanding how these supply chains work certainly helped me to understand what happens to the oil prices. It works not only in the commodity markets, works in the financial markets as well. So here's an example from a paper we published in 2021 where we looked at how shocks in the CDS market, credit default swaps market, propagate through supply chains. Now, credit default swaps, as might not be aware, are essentially insurance contracts on corporate defaults. The price of that insurance is measured in spread on the swaps. So the higher the spread, the higher the price you're paying for this insurance. In this picture, what you're seeing over the 3 months period on the x-axis are the spreads on credit default swaps of 3 companies: Ford, the solid black line; American Axle, which is a supplier of Ford, that's the black dashed line; and AMD, a semiconductor manufacturer that, as far as we know, has no relationship supply chain-wise with either Ford or with American Axle. Looking at this picture, looking at the spreads of these companies over time, one thing jumps at me at least is that there is clearly a correlation between the spreads of American Axle and Ford, but there's no such correlation with the AMD. And that gives me an idea. Can I use the information about supply chains in order to be able to describe how CDS markets work? Are the shocks in the CDS markets, are they propagating along the supply chain channels? They should, right? And in fact, we do this study in a paper full of all kinds of tables and wonderful, significant results. But I'll just show you one picture that tells all of the story, more or less. So we computed the abnormal credit default swaps. So just looking at the idiosyncratic component of the shocks relative to an appropriate index. And we looked at the extreme movements of those abnormal credit default swap spreads. And for the companies that experience that movement, we call it jump, we look at their customers' credit default swap spreads, abnormal, and their suppliers. And what we found is that indeed, if you look at the customers and the suppliers, if the focal company had an increase in the spread, abnormal spread, so did their customers and suppliers on the same day. So day 0 is the event day. And same goes for the down jumps. When the risk declined, there was a jump down, the price for the customers and suppliers also went down. And this pattern extended beyond the immediate customers and suppliers. We saw the same pattern in the second-tier customer suppliers and the third-tier customer suppliers. So if you understand how supply chains are structured, if you have the visibility into the supply chain, you can do a better job pricing credit default swaps. Understanding supply chain helps you with working in the markets. So far, so good? Okay, all right. You guys are very relaxed audience. So the way we define the events is we look at the credit default swaps themselves, and we see the very large movement of abnormal credit default swap, and that's what we treat as an event. And then we look at the customers and supplier and looking at their credit default swap, saying, hey, did they go up or down at the same time, or next day, or day after, etc. So economically, it makes sense to me, at least, right? If you, the fact that you experience, let's say you are Ford, right? You experience a jump in your credit default swaps. Suddenly, you're much greater risk for American Axle and every other supplier, right? So if you have trade relationships with Ford, right? If you have trade credit with Ford, suddenly you have much higher credit risk exposure, right? And so the market should react to that, and they seem to, right? And vice versa, if the supplier is about to go into financial distress, that has all kinds of consequences for the manufacturers, for the companies that buy from those suppliers. They need to find a new one that's expensive. It will take them time. They will have all kinds of disruptions. And supply disruptions, as we all experienced during COVID times, can be very, very expensive. And that's the logic that we're reading through this. All right, so I talked about how supply chains can help us with the markets. Now I'm going to change the story and talk about, for the rest of the presentation, how the markets will help us with supply chains. Because after all, I know more about supply chains than markets, so I'm trying to help the supply chains. The two key elements I will try to address, the fundamental problems that what we're trying to do in the paper that we wrote, is deal with two problems typical in supply chains. One is the low transparency, not being able to see how valuable are the goods that are flowing through the supply chain. Do customers really want them? How much are they willing to pay? I have no idea. And second one is try to reconcile this constant, persistent mismatch between supply and demand. These are the two problems. I mentioned the pandemic already, right? Have you guys experienced any kind of pandemic-related supply disruptions? Did you have to look for toilet paper and it wasn't there? What about rice or pasta? Hand sanitizer? After the pandemic, that didn't stop. So the picture on the empty shelves in the United States when we had a shortage of baby formula. Okay? And if this is what you need to feed your baby, you're kind of stuck. You need to feed your baby, right? And you couldn't find the baby formula. At the same time, across the border in Canada, there was plenty of baby formula. So this is kind of a typical situation that in some locations, maybe at some times, you have empty shelves in one place and the shelves are just overflowing with inventory in other places. I'm going to focus on a particular structure of the supply chain. This is the one on the right side of the slide, where you have multiple companies buying from the supplier. This is called the distribution system in my world. I'll call them retailers, retailer 1, 2, 3. Although, as I'll mention next, it doesn't really have to be retail industry. They don't have to face the customers per se. It works in other parts, B2B as well. They will be facing, well, several different types of shocks. Their customers might have different valuation for the product from those retailers. So P1, P2, P3 will be these different valuations. And also they will be subject to different shocks, demand shocks from the customers. So that's on D3 there. As I mentioned, it doesn't have to be retail. You don't have to think of a local grocery store as an example. You can think of companies that are running chassis in the LA, Long Beach port. There's 3 companies, as luck would have it. And for me, that I already had 3 retailers in my picture. These companies effectively offering the same type of chassis for the customers. I'm not an expert in chassis, but as far as I can tell, they're identical products. The only difference between them is the decals that they put on them. You might tell me they're different. And they're satisfying the customers they have relationship with, and they have different values, these customers. And demands of the customers are fluctuating randomly. So similar situation, similar structure. So if I understand retail setting, I'll understand many other settings as well. The difficulty is that when these companies are operating, often their chassis end up in the wrong place, wrong location. Then they cannot serve the next customer, so they have a shortage, or they have chassis piling up. It's all kind of logistical issues. They need to move those chassis physically around. Takes time, it's expensive. Lots of problems. So the question is, how do you run the system better? Fundamental question. How do you make the supply meet demand in the system better? Operations people have a number of answers to this question. One is to say, hey, why don't we combine together all of the inventory and run it from one central location? That's great. It has some downsides, like how do you still keep the separate ownership of the assets if that's what you want to retain, and will not centralizing the inventory physically is a sensible thing to do logistically. There is another solution, kind of produces very similar result, and that's what those three companies did. They created a pool of chassis. I'll call this transshipments between the retailers. So if you have a shortage of particular chassis, you contact other company and they send that chassis to you, customer. Or if you have excess chassis and somebody else needs it, you ship it to them and they can use it. This works. There's a couple of downsides, like there's no public signal about how valuable of the chassis. Are we constantly running out of them? Are we like balanced, not balanced? How much value is there to have more of them? So that doesn't get publicly released. And also terms tend to be preset. And so in the paper that I'm about to present, we ask a different question. We say, how about we take the power of the markets and bring that power into the setting and see what we can do, how much benefit we can generate. In the markets, we can allow arbitrary trades. So they can trade any way they want to. We're going to structure it somewhat, but in principle, you can trade any way you want to. We don't need to restrict the shipments of those chassis or those goods or those inventory only between the two companies. One of them have shortage, another one has excess. We can also ship from, say, retailer 1 to retailer 2, even if both of them have shortage, as long as the value that generated by serving the customers of retailer 2, P2, is higher than the value of serving the customers of retailer 1. And hopefully the markets will help them to come to an agreement to divide that value up. Yep. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I think the key word is exactly the last word you mentioned, or next to the last, penultimate, non-marketable goods, right? Because they're not traded in the market, there's no price for it. And it's not spot transactions. Typically, you have long relationship between the customers and the providers of the products here. So they might have already prices specified at which they sell. Of course, customer needs fluctuate. So this P1, P2, P3 reflects the fact that customer 1, or type customer 1, might have greater needs. They're willing to pay more money for this. Customer 2 might willing to pay less money for this. But because they don't have a market to go to and try to buy as they have the need, they don't have the ability to reach out to the other retailer directly, long-term relationships. There's no ability to adjust the prices, right? So we don't have spot, we have long-term relationship. We don't have prices to bring the supply and demand into alignment, and that's what creates this. So think about your grocery store. Sure, you can go and you have a shortage of baby formula, right? You're willing to pay a lot of money for it. How come you cannot purchase it? Even so, you're willing to pay a lot of money for it. Your baby needs formula. You're willing to pay infinite amount of money, your entire budget, right? I'm assuming. So how come it doesn't work? The reason it doesn't work is because there are frictions that prevent you from going somewhere else, like to Canada, and buying stuff there and importing it for your baby, or flying to Europe. Europe had plenty of baby formula. The US had restrictions, FDA specifically, on whether or not foreign approved baby formulas can be imported into the US. And that in large way contributed to this shortage of baby formula. Not just information. This is literally a physical restriction from the government, from ability to balance the market better. But even without the government messing up, and I'm going to take very ungenerous view on the government, so if anybody working on the government, I'm not picking on you, I swear, I love the government. But at any moment of time, you have physical restrictions on getting the customer in front of the product so that the customer can get the product. And there is an ability of that customer to go somewhere else and look for that product. So there are search costs, there are all kinds, it's not just information, there's physical, logistical ways of getting product physically in the right place where that customer physically located. And so that's what creates this inability to have a perfect market where the prices do their magic thing and match the supply and demand. Yes, you guys are studying those problems. When you relieve those physical restrictions, you get a commodity market, awesome, efficient, you get prices doing wondrous things. It works. It's still complicated, but it's a different type of problem. The whole point is, yeah, I wish we could make it work. And in a small way, and I want to emphasize the word small, what our paper does is exactly that. Tries to say, hey, what if we had a way of getting the markets there working? And I'll talk about this point in a second. Right, so I said wonderful if you can have arbitrary trades. Another benefit of the market clearly is that if we have a market, there's a price. If price and it's high, supplier gets a signal. These people need more product. Let me start producing the next batch. Regulator maybe gets a signal. Let's start importing from Canada and Europe. That markets are not common, right? And the reason they're not common because products are not commoditized. It's really hard for some of the, well, most of the products to have a large market going, and the cost of operating and creating a market is not trivial. And so that's why in most of the circumstances in the supply chains, we don't have the luxury of meeting supply and demand. Now, we make an argument in the paper that the newfangled technology like blockchain marginally can help and create markets in some places where they currently don't exist. It's not a panacea, it won't solve every problem, but it might help marginally. I'll say a few words about that. Most of my talk, however, will be focused on the highlighted part, which is this type of markets, if we're able to create it, will almost by definition have very few participants. And we need to understand, when you have few participants, how their behavioral attitudes and biases and all of the wonderful things that we learn from behavioral economics influence the way that those markets will work. And what does it mean in the supply chain context? When those markets are introduced, what does it do to the supplier? How does the supplier view that? These are the type of questions that I'll try to address. Okay, now, comedic break, so we can relax. As I mentioned, we talk about blockchain being a solution. I'm not a blockchain bro, but we wrote several articles on the topic of blockchains and supply chains. This is not cryptocurrency, these are applications of blockchains and supply chains, and I think we have very balanced perspective on this. We have 5 things which are the strength of the blockchain technology when applied to supply chain management, operations management. And for every strength, there is a weakness. So it's a very balanced perspective. So I encourage you to check out those papers. They're really fun, I think. And of course, I'm completely unbiased. But they give you perspective. So talking to the companies that try to implement the blockchain technology in their supply chains, I did get confirmation that indeed the topics that we raise and the issues we identified are the issues that they struggle with. So I get some confirmation that this is not just academics thinking. But the typical sales pitch for the blockchain goes like this. A consultant shows up in your office, start pitching you, right? What should we do? Blockchain, and then the usual script, right? It changes everything. Everybody's talking about it. The potential applications are endless. And don't forget, this is what makes the sale. We don't want to be left behind. So when you make it this speech, that's the key part. And then when you ask them questions, well, what does it mean exactly? They switch to the next buzzword like AI. Right? Does that sound familiar? All right. So what will happen if we introduce markets into this distribution system? Here are the research questions. Will the markets help to match the supply and demand better? And they better, because if they don't, then I have nothing else to talk about. The interesting part is how will they do this? In particular, it would be really nice if the market clearing price reflected the value of the goods in this distribution system, right? Somehow it should reflect what the customers view, how valuable they view those goods. That should be reflected in the market price. So that's one. Another one is, do the markets affect the initial orders to the supplier, and how? Next one, what are the trading and ordering strategies that the participants of the market, these retailers, will use? And the last one, who benefits in this system from introduction of the markets? So I'll talk about all of these questions. To answer these questions, we create an online platform for running experiments, and I'll give you the website at the end of the talk. We run a number of experiments. In all of the experiments, we do the following. We take the structure of the supply chain. We use the humans to play the role of the retailers. The ordering from a supplier played by a computer. The retailers we group into the markets of different sizes to see how that matters. They play several rounds so that they get acclimated to the game first, and second of all, so that we collect more data. Every round, it's the same sequence of events. The round begins by us telling the human participant, say retailer one, what their customers are willing to pay for 1 unit of their products. So they know that information. They don't know what customers of other retailers are willing to pay. All they know is the distribution of those valuations. So they know the other retailers face the customers that are willing to pay uniform distribution between 51 and 100, but they don't know exactly how much other customers are willing to pay. Next step, the retailers are placing orders with the supplier. We call those tokens, they're buying tokens using blockchain terminology, but you can think that they're buying claims to the capacity of the supplier. They do this without knowing what the final demand is going to be. All they know is that that demand is somewhere between uniformly distributed 0 and 200. That's the information they have. Then we tell them what the final demand is. And the next steps depend on whether there is a market in the experiment or not. If there's a market, then they have an opportunity, now that they know the price, they know what their final demand is, they can go into the market and submit buy and sell orders. I'll describe them on the next slide. We collect all of the buy and sell orders, generate market clearing price, generate how much different retailers get allocation, whether they're buying or selling. Could be positive, negative number. Not all orders will be executed. Some will be partially executed. So this A could be positive, negative, and it doesn't have to match exactly what they submitted as buying or selling. And then, given the adjusted supply, so the initial orders they had, plus the adjustment from the market, they sell to the customers the minimum between the customer demand and the supply that they have, initial plus adjustment from the market. And then they review the results, how much profit they generated. There's no carryover of items between the rounds, so if you have items left over, they go expire. There's no carryover of customer demand between the rounds, so if the customers weren't satisfied this round, you cannot satisfy them in the next round. They go away as well. Let's see. Ooh, oh, good. To make the problem easier for our participants to solve, we make all of the random shocks here, which is all of the P's, all of the D's, independent from each other. Obviously, in real life, they're correlated, but you can think that once you take out the correlation, the remaining parts are independent. We're just focusing on the easier solution for our participants. And everybody knows what supplier price is. We call it wholesale price using the operations language, and that's known. Here's how the market works in our setting. We run it using as a blind double-sided batch auction. One of the reasons for running the market this way is we want to avoid market manipulations by the players, given that there are few of them in the market. And it's easy for them to try to spoof other people's valuations and form the trading strategy based on it. We want to avoid that. However, we give them as much flexibility as we can to form any trading strategies they want. So we collect from them up to 5, and this is purely for interface reasons. There's no need, 5 is not a magical number by any chance. They don't have to submit any. They can submit 3, 2, 1. Buy and sell orders in any combination. You can submit buy orders and sell orders simultaneously. That's up to you. These are limit orders, so you're specifying how many units you want to buy and the maximum per unit price you're willing to pay for it. Similar for the sell orders, you submit how many units you want to sell and the minimum price you're willing to receive for it. Fairly standard. Then once we have all of the orders in, and when players submit the orders, they have no visibility in the order book. They have no visibility what other people are submitting. We form demand and supply curves in the standard manner, right? We sort all of the sell orders, here's an example of it, from the smallest price to the highest, and the orange line corresponds to it. So for example, first 14 units per unit price 51, next 21 units per unit price 53, etc. For the buy orders, we sort them from the highest price to the lowest, and that's our demand curve, right? First 19 units, price 76, next 16 units, price 55, etc. And then we go left to right, unit by unit, matching them on the buy and the sell side, as long as the sell price less than the buy price. And for the last unit for which this is the case, we average the buy and sell prices, and this is our market clearing price. Again, fairly standard setup, I hope. So in this example, market clearing price is $54. That's average of those two. Everybody who bought units and the buy orders were executed. So these are the guys. They pay $54, even so they're willing to pay more. Everybody who sold units receiving $54, even so they were willing to receive less. And not all orders got executed in this example. Pretty clear? Okay. We ran 6 experiments with 2 different wholesale prices that supplier charges, so that we have different risk exposure of our players, right? If you have wholesale price of 10 when initially you buy and you put in little money at risk, because you don't know the demand. When you buy it at 50, you put in more money at risk. So that could change your attitudes. And we also have 3 different market sizes. We have two experiments, the first column here, without any markets at all. We call it news vendor experiments. If you heard about operations people talk, they talk about news vendor a lot. Our model matches the news vendor model exactly. So that's why we call it news vendor, no market experiments. We have markets of small sizes where we group the retailers in groups of 3. And we have, this is GIS3 experiments, and we have large market experiments where we take all of the retailers playing the game and put them in a single market. We call it group of all experiments. And as always, we incentivize them financially to do a good job, and the standard things and behavioral stuff applies. Without going into those details, let me tell you what are the interesting things that we find. So, I'll tell you research questions, our hypothesis, and show you results on the same slide. So the research question was, do markets reduce supply-demand mismatch? Our hypothesis was the better, and indeed they do. What you're seeing on this graph is the reduction in the average excess shortage and leftover inventory per retailer in different experiments. So these are experiments. Stars indicate statistical significance. The gray bars are not statistically significant. Thank you, ChatGPT, for helping me create this picture. And we're seeing that indeed, all of the reduction, positive numbers, most of them significant, and the larger markets work better. Duh. Big surprise there. Let's move to the interesting question. How do they do this, markets? For example, does the market clearing price reflect product value? So here we have a hypothesis that they should, but what is the product value? There are 2 dimensions to the product value. One is the net supply-demand mismatch in the market, right? All of the retailers have different dimensions, and depending on the roll of a die, maybe they need more items in the market, maybe they need to have fewer items in the market, so market clearing prices should reflect that. Similarly, for the valuation of the customers, so P1, P2, P3, if these are higher, the market clearing prices should reflect that. And if the valuation of the customers is lower, the market clearing prices should reflect that as well. Makes sense, right? Now, let's take a look. In this graph, what you're seeing are the market clearing prices, again, in different experiments. On the left are the experiments with the wholesale price of 50. On the right, experiments with the wholesale price of 10. On the x-axis are the rounds of the game. We play 20 rounds. We threw away first 5. So what you're seeing are the remaining 15 rounds. The curves that you're seeing are different market clearing prices. So the solid blue is from the GA experiments, where all of the retailers in one big market. The orange box and whiskers are the market clearing prices in the GIS3 experiments, small market experiments. Because every round we have multiple markets, we have multiple market clearing prices, 1 per market. The variation in that is in the box and whiskers. We also average out those prices, and that's the dashed orange line. The dotted lines on those graphs is the valuation of the customers, average valuation of the customers. These are the P1, P2, P3s. So these are the valuations, just to give you an idea how in different rounds valuations were, and you can see whether they're correlated with the market clearing prices or not. So are the pictures clear? So what do we see in these pictures? One effect which is really, really powerful, jumps at you right away, is the anchoring that happens to the wholesale price that the retailers pay. Look at the solid blue line and experiments with the with the wholesale price of 50. The solid blue line is pretty much at the level of 50. Look at the solid blue line in experiments with the wholesale price of 10. The solid blue line is pretty much at 10. It's amazing. There's no economic reason that I can think of for the market clearing prices to get so close and be tied to the wholesale prices. You already purchased the items from the supplier. It's already spilled milk. If you have shortage, you need to buy, and you should be willing to pay up to what your customers are paying you. If you have excess, this is useless to you at the end of the round. You should sell it at any price. $1 is great. And yet we're seeing that most of the players submit the orders such that we have very strong anchoring. For the small markets, there's also anchoring happening. So the orange bars here and the line here are slightly above this one. It's statistically significant, the differences. Less obvious visually. Purely behavioral artifact. Could be mechanical. They see the price they just pay to the supplier, and this is what they focus on when they submit their market orders. Could be they're not willing to recognize the losses, right? I could have bought from the supplier for $10, and now I go into the market. I'm not going to submit it's higher than $10 because I feel stupid. Or I bought at $50 from my supplier. Even so, I don't need the units. I'm not willing to go into the market and start selling them at $1 because I'll feel stupid. Very strong behavioral effect. What else do we see? There is bigger variability in the small markets. Even after I average out the market clearing prices, they're still more variable, the orange lines, than the solid blue lines. And now the kicker is the following statement. When we do all of the regressions, I'm not going to show you the tables, unless you ask me to. We find that market clearing prices signal the value of the goods, both in the net demand and the average retail price in the small markets, but they do not do so in the large markets. And that's kind of obvious. If you look at this solid blue line, there's no variability here. So there's no correlation to have with the retail prices, or for that matter, net demand. So partial success for the markets, and that's kind of surprising, very surprising. Just to summarize intermediate statement here, is that for small markets, markets indeed provided us signal about how valuable the goods are. The large markets did not. You know, kind of a saving grace maybe for the large markets that we don't need this design of the market. We can use a more standard market design, and maybe then the prices will reflect the value of the goods. So somewhat saving grace for the markets there. But if we run the market like that in the large markets, we don't get the signal. And the anchoring was purely behavioral. That is correct. So between rounds, there's no carryover. So what we know from operations is that it fundamentally doesn't change the insights. There will be kind of less drastic findings, but the fundamental insights will typically remain the same. We haven't run experiments to confirm it, but from the knowledge of the operations literature prior to this, that's a statement based on that. So it's simplifying assumption for the sake of our participants as much as for our analysis, but it should not make a fundamental difference even if we introduce the inventory and the customer carryover. Naturally. And again, we're doing it to get the glimpse, right? We're not saying, hey, Let's go run the markets like that. Or every product falls into this category. However, even if you have inventory carryover, one of the beautiful, beautiful results in operations that under some other assumptions, naturally, you can convert the problem where you have inventory carryover into a sequence of problems where there's no carryover of inventory at all. And you can solve this no carryover problem very easily. And that's the beautiful part. And get the results, and then translate it back into the model where you have the carryover of inventory. So although it is certainly simplifying assumption, it's not really that terrible an assumption, right? We can work around it if we have to. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. So correct. So what we want to avoid is here in the multi-round is really just for us to generate multiple observations. We randomize who you're playing against in different rounds, and the players don't know who they're playing against. So for one of other things that's important is that you cannot build reputation and relationships in the market in our setting. It doesn't matter in commodity markets, somewhat matters, but in our case, it would matter with fewer participants. We intentionally turn it off. What we want to avoid, even within a single market, we could have, and we have a version of the game, and we did play this version in some of our experiments that are not included here, and the results kind of similar to these ones, but you do see people doing the following strategy, which is very logical. Even I would do it, and I'm not that smart. I don't know how much the other people valuations are. So what I'll do, I'll put an order for 1 unit. If they bite, I know exactly the price they're willing to bite at. I put the next order, which is so I'm kind of like front running, not quite, but front running, and that's the one that we wanted to eliminate. We don't see it a lot in the experiments when we have this continuous trading within the market, but we do see that occasionally come up with our players. I don't think so. So if I can give an argument, I don't have a feel that this is what's driving the results, that this is single round versus multiple rounds. Yeah, I don't think so. Right, so you do, and when you have a small market, they become more prominent and they have much more likelihood to affect the market prices, right? When you have 3 players in the market only, you get very extreme movements, and that's something we want to avoid, but that's a setting that supply chains might put us in, with maybe not 3, but sometimes even 3, that you still have like with really, really tiny market, right? And we want to step away and keep them from doing this stuff. So, all right, so that was interesting. But now let's look at the supply chain perspective. The supply chain would be, okay, what does the supplier see? You introduce the market. How does it affect the orders that supplier receives? We have 2 hypotheses based on the previous literature on simpler problems with the central planner that operations people solved, that when we introduce the market, the players will start placing orders closer to the mean or median demand. In our case, it's the same. And the larger the market, the stronger the effect. That's the hypothesis. So we look at the average orders, and that's the picture. In the center here is the mean median demand, 100. On the 2 extremes are the experiments without markets. And we introduce markets, the orders on average move closer to the mean demand, as we expected. And it seems like if you have a larger market, you get closer, although we cannot take them statistically, tell them apart statistically. If you are a supplier, are you happy with this or not? That's the question to ask. You didn't have a market, and your wholesale price was 50, market was introduced, and the average orders you're seeing moved up. Great, right? But if you're a supplier and your wholesale price you were charging is 10, market was introduced, and your average orders went down. Terrible. So we're seeing that depending on what type of supplier retailer relationship there was, what price there was, the consequence of the market could be very different for the supplier. Well, maybe if I'm a supplier, this one with the wholesale price of 10, yeah, it's true that the average orders went down. I'm not happy about that at all, but maybe there's a consolation price for me. Maybe the variation in the orders also went down, right? We know that variability is bad, at least operations people think so. It's hard to plan your production if you have highly variable orders. You don't know exactly how much you need to start scheduling your production runs. So maybe you get the benefit of reduced variability as supplier of this type. Let's take a look at variability. So this is the coefficient of variation in different experiments, and I want you to pay attention to the graph on the right for the Nusswender G310 and GA10 experiments. The gray dotted line at the bottom, no markets coefficient of variation. The line above it, small markets coefficient of variation of orders that supplier sees. And the highest up, the coefficient of variation when we introduce a large market that supplier faces them. So not only that supplier had smaller orders on average, the variability of those orders went up as well. Double whammy, double jeopardy for that supplier. Now notice that I didn't change anything about the randomness of the demand that the retailers are facing, right? That variability stayed the same. And yet, the variability that supplier sees went through the roof. Extra credit question. Do you know how this effect is called when the variability of orders increases upstream the supply chain? If anybody knows it, I'll buy you a drink. This guy gets a drink. That is exactly right. This phenomena is called the bullwhip effect. The fact that as you go from the final customer, and I love this example, baby's demand for either baby food or diapers, depending which end of the baby you're looking at, is fairly stable. So the parents are facing fairly stable demand for, let's say, baby formula. The retail stores face much more variable demand from the parents, and the manufacturers of the baby formula facing more variable demand from the retail stores. That's the bullwhip effect. What we just saw is that by introducing the markets, we created bullwhip effect. The original variation from the consumers did not change, but the variation to the supplier went up. Isn't that interesting? Right? So what do we see from supplier's perspective? Higher variation, bullwhip effect, and also pull to the mean effect. That's the finding from the experiments. Well, that's kind of curious. How is this happening? Right? We have orders going to the mean and at the same time becoming more variable. That sounds crazy. Let's take a look at the orders themselves. How are the trading strategies and the ordering strategies, and I'll focus on ordering strategies, how do they look like? Here's the distribution of the orders in those experiments, histogram of it. So you see individual orders more or less. Couple of observations here. There are 3 experiments, the gray bars, no markets, the orange ones, small markets, the blue ones, large markets. We see that when we introduce markets, there's a spike of orders around 100. That's the pull to the mean effect. Everybody orders around 100, close to the average demand. Demand is between 0 and 200 uniform. Average is 100. So that's what we were expecting. There's another interesting behavior. There's also a spike of orders of size 0. So you are a retailer, you're facing customer demand, you know it's going to be 0 and 200, and you're placing no orders from your supplier. What are you thinking? Even crazier, look at the right. There is a spike of orders at 200. It goes crazier than that. 250. Your maximum demand is 200. You cannot carry over items to the next round. Why are you placing 250? 300? Some people placing 400. No. And they know that. Are they crazy? That's one. I thought so too, yeah. What are they doing? Maybe they don't understand how this game works. That's a possibility too, right? What's happening? So we thought about this. I did not, I have to tell you honestly, I did not think about this ahead of seeing this graph. And then we realized what they're doing. If you are the retailer, what is your problem? Your problem is you don't know what the demand is going to be. Could be high, could be low. You put in money at stake initially, and then demand is higher than you expected. I wish I had ordered more. Demand is lower than you expected. Damn, I wasted my money, right? That's the challenge. Not knowing the demand, that's where the risk is coming from. They figured out a way of avoiding that risk. What is the way? Well, let me not order anything initially. Wait until I learn what the demand is. Go to the market and buy what I need from the market. It's brilliant. And there's an opposite, so we call the strategy spot buying for obvious reasons. You buy on the spot. And there's a mirror strategy to that, which is, let me buy more than I can possibly need, wait until I learn the demand, and then sell what I don't need into the market. That's spot selling. I love the symmetry there, right? If you have spot buyers and spot sellers, they're helping each other out. You know, whoever has excess, they're artificially putting themselves in excess shortage situations, and they help each other out. These are brilliant guys, smarter than me for sure. In fact, we think about this and say, well, what other strategy we didn't think about? So we do a bit of the unsupervised machine learning, clustering analysis. We come up with all kind of criteria and whatnot. I'll show you the results of those clusters of the strategies that we thought us through. We came up with 5 strategies. So the spot buyer, spot seller, these are 2 strategies. There are also a strategy which we call new surrender strategy. This is the strategy where you behave in your initial orders as if you weren't planning to trade in the markets at all. We can compute how much profit you would be earning in this case and measure how far your actual profit deviates from that strategy. And if people are playing strategies that have the same financial consequences for them as being new surrender, we call them new surrender strategies. There's another strategy which we call transshipper strategy. That strategy, you order in initially, anticipating that when the market happens, there will be a central planner that will run that market in the most efficient way. Basically, allocate the value items in the market in a way that maximizes the total value in the economy. We can solve that problem, compare how much you deviate from it financially, and if you deviate very little, and this is, by the way, the graph's deviation from that strategy transshipper, we put you in the category of being transshipper strategies. And we have these 5 categories of strategies. So the question is, which does the best? I already said that the spot buyer, spot seller are brilliant guys. They're geniuses. So how do other strategies do relative to those geniuses? Well, you don't need to just to the spot sellers, or spot buyers, I'm sorry. You don't need to buy from the spot sellers. You can buy and sell from anybody else in the market. So, you know, certainly it helps if both are present simultaneously, but you can sell one item at a time to other players as well. But you are exactly asking the one where you buy, anticipating that a central planner will maximize the value for everybody when the market happens. We use that as a base case and compare the profits of everybody else relative to that. And if your profit is higher and is significant relative to transfer, then you get a green color. If your profit is lower and statistically significantly lower, you get a red one. So looking at this, and I'm coming to your question in a second. Looking at this, immediate takeaway is there's an ocean of red, small island of green, right? So everybody does worse than a transshipper. Even the genius guys, spot buyers, spot sellers, they do worse. In fact, if you squint and you look at the numbers, they do much worse. And now, why? And I'll answer the question. So this is what's happening. The problem is you have no idea what demand is going to be. So randomness of the demand is one risk you are taking. News vendors, if you follow that strategy, are fully taking on the risk of uncertain demand. Spot buyers, spot sellers get rid of the risk of uncertain demand because they don't act until after they learn the demand. But they're taking on the risk from the market. And the markets are small. Liquidity is an issue. Yeah, you want to sell 200 units in the market. Nobody wants to buy 200 units from you. You want to buy 50 units from the market. There's no 50 units to buy from the market. Liquidity shocks happen a lot. Not only that, players do make mistakes, and we can calculate what is your exposure in your trading. When you make a mistake, we can calculate the average exposure of various players, and we find that exposure of the spot buyers, spot sellers is about 10 times exposure of the transshipper. Right? If you make a mistake of the liquidity shock, what are the consequences? 10 times as big if you are spot buyer, spot seller. And so yeah, they're geniuses as long as the strategy works. But when it doesn't work, they fail spectacularly. And on average, this is what happens. So there are two types of risks. There's a demand risk and there's a market risk. News vendor, fully committed to demand risk, taking that. Spot buyer, spot seller, fully committed to take the market risk. Both are terrible strategies. Transshipper, kind of in between. Takes a little bit of the demand risk, takes a little bit of market risk. Between the two, does great. That's the message here. Mm-hmm. That shouldn't matter. We probably could have used another one. I don't think that matters, yes. Mm-hmm. We did not impose any additional costs. We don't think it would have made a difference. Whatever the trade-offs they're facing, without those costs they're already facing here with the different wholesale prices. That's what captures that one. Mm-hmm. In our case, neither one is. Mm-hmm. You cannot buy insurance, right? There's no derivatives contracts, right? That's a separate layer of analysis, right? Well, So, yeah, maybe. It does require to. The reason why the demand risk is non-insurable is because of the, well, it's basically not traded. This type of shocks are not traded. The shocks that drives the market risk, however, are similar type of shocks. So for that reason, I want to say it's also not traded risk, right? What's driving, because I'm here deriving the market based on the mismatch between supply and demand, which is non-insurable, non-tradable risk. And also the P1, P2, P3, that's also a shock that is not priced. Sure. Sure, yes. But those shocks, so it's what you believe is, do those shocks have market price? If they do, you can trade on them. If they don't, no luck, right? It's not the fact that it's price versus assumption. No, I can give it any label I want. Fundamentally, where's the risk coming from? And I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I don't think our risk really matters, whether it's demand risk or market risk. It's the same category of risk. So either I believe both of them are tradable, or neither one is. Could be, yeah, or partially, right, absolutely. I mean, in reality, of course, part of the risk will be tradable, but that's not our focus here, so, yeah. Yes, that is the right, that is perfect, that's perfect question. Yep. So, very interesting, right? How these risks are being combined and what's the best strategy. Transshipper is the best. So the takeaway there is trust the market. Markets are good, but don't trust them too much. They're not that good. Kind of the last point to make here is who benefits with the introduction of the market. That kind of is predictable given the discussion we had so far. And here you see the percentage increase in the average profits of retailers, blue bars, suppliers, orange bars, and the supply chain, overall, green bars. From this graph, what we're seeing is that, yeah, retailers tend to benefit. Stars here mark the significance, so not always the benefit statistically significant. The supply chain, the green bars, also positive and significant. So supply chains benefit on average. Now the supplier does not. Not in all cases. In some cases, supplier benefits. In other cases, this is the experiment with the low wholesale price. Supplier suffers. We saw that already. We saw the reason, right? The pull to the mean effect, orders decline, tough luck. And here, I don't even account for the greater variability and the costs that come with that. The question along the same lines to think about is that, okay, what's going to happen next? How should this relationship, right? We have the markets, the horizontalities, and we have supply chains, verticalities. Right? We created a market in the industry. It affected this dimension of the problem. How are we going to adjust? Are the contracts between suppliers and retailers will adjust? Is the pricing of the suppliers going to go up? What should happen? What is the best way of dealing with this? You guys should think about that question. So, what did we learn? I'm not going to test you. You can relax. You don't need to produce a doctor's note. So this is what we learned. Do markets work to reduce supply-demand mismatch? Yes. How do they work? Does the market clearing price reflect the value of the goods? Sometimes. In the small markets, yes. In the large markets, surprisingly, no. How do markets affect initial orders that supplier sees? Well, we see pull to the mean effect, And we also see greater variability. We see the bullwhip effect raising its head. What ordering and trading strategies do players use? Well, we see news vendor, trend shipper, spot buyer, spot seller, and the overall conclusion there, trust the market. Don't be like news vendor, but don't trust it too much. Don't be like spot buyer, spot seller. Hedge your risks. Two risks. And who benefits? Well, retailers, supply chain, but the supplier not so much, not in all cases. So in order for this to work, you need the supplier. And how do you compensate them if they're losing value? What is the arrangement that this will accomplish? If you're interested in trying out this experiment at your school, at your workplace, we have created this platform. I gave you one example of the game we played with it with the markets. We have other games in a similar setup. We have multiple retailers, single supplier. We look at several questions. One of the questions we looked at, inspired by the pandemic, is that you have supplier with limited capacity, and retailers compete for that capacity by placing orders, and the allocation happens depending on how big your order is. If your order is bigger, you get higher priority for limited capacity. It's well known that it will cause the inflation of orders, and Nash equilibrium doesn't exist unless you put the bound. What's interesting is behaviorally how that inflation happens, and more interestingly, what happens? You share strategic information with the retailers. If I tell you how much other players ordered in the previous round before that, does it help you in strategizing how much you want to order today? No, you actually do much worse. That's the finding. And another game we played, also inspired by the pandemic, initially you have limited capacity, but then suddenly the life of plenty starts. You no longer have to compete for the limited capacity because there's plenty of capacity. Pandemic is over. How long will it take before the equilibrium orders go down to the pre-pandemic level? We give you plenty of capacity. The answer is very long time. It's really hard to get out from an equilibrium. Fun game for the students, fun game for the executives, free for academic use. If you want to use it non-academically, talk to me. We're not here to make money. We're looking for partners. We just want to make sure that we can handle the volume of requests. That's all. I'll stop here.